Sarah Martinez wiped the grease from her hands with a worn rag, the familiar smell of diesel fuel and motor oil filling her nostrils. The garage bay echoed with the sound of metal against metal as she tightened the final bolt on the Humvee's transmission. Around her, the naval base hummed with its usual activity, but Sarah remained focused on her work, lost in the mechanical precision that had become second nature to her. At 28, Sarah had been working as a vehicle mechanic for the Navy for 6 years. She had earned her place among the predominantly male crew through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to diagnose engine problems that left others scratching their heads. Her small frame often deceived people into underestimating her strength, but Sarah could handle a wrench and lift heavy parts with the best of them. The morning sun streamed through the garage windows as Commander Johnson approached her workstation. His expression was more serious than usual, and Sarah immediately sensed something important was brewing. She set down her tools and gave him her full attention, wiping her hands clean on her coveralls. "Martinez, I need you to prep 3 vehicles for a special operation," he said, his voice carrying the weight of urgency. "These aren't going to the usual training grounds. SEAL Team 6 needs them mission-ready by 1400 hours. Sarah's eyebrows raised slightly. SEAL Team 6 rarely requested her services directly, and when they did, it meant the mission was something far from ordinary. She had worked on their vehicles before, but usually through standard requisition channels. Direct requests like this typically meant the operation was classified and time-sensitive. "What kind of specs are we talking about, sir?" she asked, already mentally cataloging the modifications that might be necessary. Her experience had taught her that special operations required vehicles that could handle extreme conditions and unexpected situations. Commander Johnson handed her a folder marked with security classifications. "Everything you need is in there. The team will brief you on specific requirements, but I'm told they need maximum reliability and some custom modifications. They're leaving at 600 tomorrow." As Sarah opened the folder, she noticed the mission location was heavily redacted, but she could make out references to mountainous terrain and potential hostile contact. The vehicle requirements were extensive: reinforced armor plating, upgraded suspension systems, enhanced communication equipment, and emergency backup systems for critical components. She spent the next hour reviewing the specifications, making notes about parts she would need to requisition and modifications that would require her immediate attention. The timeline was tight, but Sarah had built her reputation on delivering quality work under pressure. She began pulling parts from inventory, her mind already working through the sequence of modifications. The first vehicle was a modified Humvee that would serve as the primary transport. Sarah started by installing additional armor plating around the engine compartment and passenger areas. The steel plates were heavy, requiring her to use the overhead crane system, but she worked with practiced efficiency. Each bolt had to be perfectly aligned. Each weld had to be flawless. As she worked, other mechanics in the garage occasionally glanced over, curious about the intense focus she was bringing to this particular job. Sarah had always been thorough, but there was something different about her approach today. She double-checked every connection, tested every system multiple times, and paid attention to details that others might consider unnecessary. The second vehicle required extensive communication equipment installation. Sarah carefully routed cables through the vehicle's frame, ensuring they were protected from potential damage while maintaining optimal signal strength. She tested each radio frequency, verified encryption protocols, and installed backup power systems that could keep communications active even if the primary electrical system failed. By late afternoon, Sarah was working on the third vehicle, a reconnaissance variant equipped with specialized surveillance equipment. The modifications required precise calibration of sensitive electronic systems, and Sarah found herself consulting technical manuals she had memorized years ago. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, but her mind was focused on the lives that would depend on her work. As evening approached, other mechanics began finishing their shifts and heading home to their families. Sarah remained in the garage working under the bright fluorescent lights. She had always been dedicated to her job, but tonight felt different. Something about the urgency in Commander Johnson's voice and the classified nature of the mission made her want to ensure everything was perfect. Around 2200 hours, she heard footsteps approaching her workstation. Looking up, she saw 3 men in Navy uniforms approaching. Even without seeing their insignia clearly, she could tell from their bearing and physical condition that these were members of SEAL Team 6. They moved with the controlled confidence that came from years of dangerous missions and life-or-death situations. The team leader, a tall man with weathered features and serious eyes, introduced himself as Lieutenant Commander Hayes. His teammates, Petty Officers Rodriguez and Thompson, flanked him as he approached Sarah's work area. They examined the vehicles with the critical eye of professionals who understood that their lives might depend on the reliability of her work. "These look good," Martinez, Hayes said after inspecting the first vehicle. "We've heard excellent things about your work. Mind walking us through the modifications?" Sarah spent the next 30 minutes explaining each system, demonstrating the backup protocols and answering their technical questions. She was impressed by their understanding of the mechanical systems and their thoughtful questions about potential failure points. These were men who understood that preparation could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. As the SEALs prepared to leave, Hayes turned back to Sarah. "We're grateful for the extra attention to detail. In our line of work, the small things often make the biggest difference." Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of pride in her contribution to their mission. She had always known her work was important, but hearing it directly from the operators who would rely on her mechanical expertise gave her a deeper appreciation for her role in the broader military mission. After the SEALs left, Sarah performed one final inspection of each vehicle. She checked fluid levels, tested electrical systems, and verified that all modifications were properly secured. By the time she finished, it was nearly midnight, but she felt confident that she had delivered her best work. As she finally locked up the garage and headed home, Sarah had no idea that in less than 18 hours, her mechanical skills would be put to a test far beyond anything she had ever imagined. The vehicles she had so carefully prepared would become lifelines in a situation that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her own capabilities and courage. The next morning arrived with an unusual request that would change everything for Sarah Martinez. At 5:30 hours, just as she was finishing her morning coffee in the garage office, Commander Johnson appeared with Lieutenant Commander Hayes and a Navy logistics officer she didn't recognize. "Martinez, there's been a change of plans," Commander Johnson announced, his expression grave. "The mission area has become more complex than initially anticipated. The team needs a mechanic to accompany them in case of vehicle breakdown in hostile territory." Sarah set down her coffee cup, processing this unexpected development. In her 6 years of service, she had never been asked to accompany a combat mission. Her role had always been preparation and repair work at the base, not field operations where bullets might fly and split-second decisions could determine survival. Hayes stepped forward, his demeanor professional but urgent. "The terrain we're heading into is brutal on vehicles, and we can't risk being stranded without mechanical support. Our intelligence suggests we might encounter conditions that could disable standard repair protocols. We need someone who can think outside the box and make battlefield repairs with limited resources." The logistics officer consulted his tablet before speaking. "Martinez, your service record shows exceptional problem-solving abilities and mechanical innovation. Command has approved your temporary assignment to this operation, pending your voluntary acceptance." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. She had joined the Navy to serve her country, but she had always imagined that service would involve working with tools and engines, not potentially facing enemy fire. However, the trust these experienced operators were placing in her abilities was both humbling and motivating. "What exactly would my role be?" she asked, wanting to understand the full scope of what she was being asked to do. Hayes pulled out a tactical map, pointing to a mountainous region marked with various symbols. "We're inserting into this area to extract a high-value target who has critical intelligence about terrorist operations. The terrain is rough, the weather is unpredictable, and the local infrastructure is essentially non-existent. If one of our vehicles breaks down, we need someone who can get it running again using whatever materials are available." The logistics officer added, "You'll receive basic combat training and equipment, but your primary responsibility will be maintaining vehicle operational status. You'll be positioned in a secured area during any direct combat operations." Sarah looked at the three men, understanding that this decision would define not just her immediate future, but potentially her entire military career. The practical part of her mind cataloged the challenges: unfamiliar terrain, limited repair supplies, working under stress in potentially dangerous conditions. But another part of her, The part that had always risen to meet mechanical challenges others couldn't solve, was intrigued by the complexity of the problem. "How long do I have to prepare?" she asked, her tone indicating she was leaning toward acceptance. 4 hours, Hayes replied. "We lift off at 10:30 if you're coming with us. You'll need to complete accelerated combat familiarization and equipment fitting." Sarah took a deep breath, thinking about her family back home in Texas who would worry if they knew what she was about to undertake. But she also thought about the trust these elite operators were placing in her skills and the potential importance of their mission to national security. "I'll do it," she said firmly, "but I need to requisition additional repair supplies and tools that weren't in the original vehicle loadout." The next 3 hours passed in a blur of intensive preparation. Sarah was fitted with body armor, given basic weapons training, and briefed on communication protocols. The equipment felt foreign and heavy compared to her usual work clothes, but she focused on adapting quickly to the new requirements. Meanwhile, she supervised the loading of an expanded toolkit and emergency repair supplies into the vehicles. She included welding equipment, extra belts and hoses, electrical components, and a variety of improvised repair materials that experience had taught her could be invaluable in unexpected situations. The weapons training was particularly challenging for Sarah. While she had completed basic marksmanship qualifications during her initial Navy training, she had never expected to need those skills in actual combat situations. The instructor, a grizzled chief petty officer, walked her through the basics of the M4 carbine she would carry. "Remember, Martinez, your job is fixing vehicles, not engaging the enemy," he told her as they practiced loading and unloading the weapon. "But if everything goes sideways, you need to be able to protect yourself and your teammates." As departure time approached, Sarah found herself in the company of the full SEAL team for the first time. Besides Hayes, Rodriguez, and Thompson, there were 3 other operators, Petty Officers Anderson, Clark, and Wilson. Each man was a specialist in different aspects of combat operations. From explosives to communications to medical support, they treated her with professional respect, understanding that her presence on the mission indicated her skills were considered essential by command. However, Sarah could sense their natural concern about having a non-combat specialist in their team, particularly in what they clearly expected to be a dangerous operation. Rodriguez, a communications specialist with a friendly demeanor, took time to explain some of the tactical procedures she might need to understand. "The key thing is staying calm and following orders quickly," he told her as they loaded into the transport helicopter. "We've all trained for years to work together as a unit. Your job is being the best mechanic you can be and trusting us to handle the security aspects." As the helicopter lifted off from the base, Sarah looked down at the familiar buildings and equipment yards that had been her world for the past 6 years. The view reminded her of how much her life had just changed in the span of a few hours. This morning she had been a base mechanic with a routine assignment. Now she was heading into unknown territory with some of the military's most elite operators. During the flight, Hayes briefed the team on intelligence updates and potential complications. The target they were extracting had information about planned terrorist attacks on American soil, making the mission critical to national security. However, recent satellite imagery suggested increased hostile activity in the area, meaning they might face resistance during the extraction. Sarah listened carefully, trying to understand how vehicle reliability would factor into the mission's success. If they encountered mechanical problems during extraction, especially under hostile fire, her ability to make rapid repairs could determine whether everyone made it out alive. As the helicopter flew over increasingly rugged terrain, Sarah realized she was about to face. The helicopter touched down in a remote mountain valley as dawn was breaking over the jagged peaks. Sarah felt her stomach drop not from the landing, but from the reality of where she now found herself. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, with rocky terrain that would challenge even the specially modified vehicles she had prepared. As the team quickly unloaded their equipment and vehicles, Sarah noticed the immediate difference in how the SEALs operated compared to base personnel. Every movement was purposeful and efficient, with no wasted motion or unnecessary conversation. They communicated through hand signals and brief, precise verbal exchanges that conveyed maximum information in minimum time. The 3 vehicles she had worked on so carefully looked different in this environment. What had seemed like robust modifications in the controlled environment of the garage now appeared almost fragile against the backdrop of hostile territory where enemy forces could be watching from any ridge or valley. Hayes gathered the team around a tactical map spread on the hood of the lead vehicle. Target building is approximately 15 kilometers northeast of our current position, he explained, pointing to a structure marked on the map. Intelligence suggests minimal security, but we need to assume that could change rapidly. Sarah studied the route they would take, noting several points where the terrain looked particularly challenging for vehicles. She had spent hours studying topographical maps during her preparation, but seeing the actual landscape made her realize how critical vehicle reliability would be to their survival. Martinez, you'll stay with the vehicles at the overwatch position, Hayes continued, indicating a spot roughly 2 kilometers from the target building. Rodriguez will remain with you to maintain communications with the extraction team. If we run into problems and need emergency vehicle support, we'll need you ready to move immediately. The team spent the next hour conducting final equipment checks and reviewing contingency plans. Sarah double-checked the emergency repair kits in each vehicle, ensuring tools and supplies were easily accessible if needed under stress. She also familiarized herself with the modified communication equipment, understanding that staying in contact with the team could be crucial. As they prepared to move out, Wilson, the team's medic, approached Sarah with additional equipment. These are emergency medical supplies, he explained, showing her a compact trauma kit. You probably won't need them, but in our line of work, everyone needs to be prepared for medical emergencies. The drive to the overwatch position was Sarah's first experience with vehicle operations in hostile territory. The modified suspension systems she had installed performed well on the rough terrain, but she could feel the stress that constant vigilance placed on both equipment and personnel. Every sound outside the vehicle could potentially indicate enemy contact, and every mechanical vibration required assessment to determine if it represented normal operation or developing problems. Rodriguez proved to be an excellent companion for the overwatch mission. His calm professionalism helped ease Sarah's nervousness about her first combat deployment, while his expertise with communication equipment ensured they maintained constant contact with the extraction team. The key to overwatch is patience, he explained, as they established their position. Most of the time, nothing happens. But when something does happen, everything changes very quickly. They positioned the vehicles for maximum mobility while maintaining concealment from potential enemy observation. Sarah used the time to perform detailed inspections of all 3 vehicles, checking for any issues that might have developed during the transit to their current position. Around midday, they received the first communication from the extraction team. Hayes reported that they had reached the target building and located the high-value target, but the situation was more complex than anticipated. Additional hostile forces were in the area, and extraction would need to be accelerated. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she realized the mission was becoming more dangerous than originally planned. She double-checked the readiness of all vehicles, ensuring they could move immediately if the extraction team needed emergency support or rapid evacuation. 30 minutes later, the radio crackled with urgent communications. The extraction team had encountered unexpected resistance and was requesting immediate vehicle support. Sarah could hear gunfire in the background of the radio transmissions, making the danger of the situation unmistakably clear. Martinez, we need to move now, Rodriguez announced, jumping into the lead vehicle. The team is under fire and needs extraction support immediately. Sarah's training took over as she started the engine and began driving toward the target location. The vehicle modifications she had made proved their worth as they navigated difficult terrain at high speed, but she could feel the mechanical stress of pushing the equipment to its limits. As they approached the target area, the sound of gunfire became clearly audible even over the vehicle engines. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions, indicating a significant firefight was in progress. Her mechanical instincts told her to be cautious with the vehicles, but her understanding of the situation told her that speed was more important than preservation of equipment. Rodriguez was coordinating with the extraction team through his radio, providing updates on their approach and receiving tactical information about enemy positions. Sarah focused on driving, but she could hear enough of the communications to understand that the SEALs were outnumbered and in serious danger. When they reached the extraction point, Sarah saw her first direct evidence of combat. Bullet holes marked several surfaces around the target building, and she could see the extraction team taking cover behind various obstacles while maintaining defensive fire against multiple enemy positions. Stay with the vehicles and keep them running, Rodriguez instructed as he prepared to join the firefight. If anyone gets wounded, we'll need immediate evacuation capability. Sarah positioned the vehicles for rapid loading while keeping the engines running and ready for immediate departure. She could see the extraction team moving toward their position, but enemy fire was preventing them from reaching the vehicles quickly. Suddenly, she heard a mechanical sound that made her heart sink. One of the vehicles had developed what sounded like a serious engine problem, possibly from debris damage or the stress of high-speed operation over rough terrain. If they lost vehicle capability now, with the team under fire and needing immediate evacuation, the consequences could be catastrophic. Sarah grabbed her toolkit and headed toward the damaged vehicle, knowing that her mechanical skills were about to be tested under the most extreme conditions she had ever faced. Enemy bullets were impacting nearby, but her focus narrowed to diagnosing and fixing the problem that could determine whether everyone made it out alive. As she opened the hood and began assessing the damage, Sarah realized that everything in her military career had been preparation for this moment. Under the hood of the damaged vehicle, Sarah could see the problem immediately. A piece of shrapnel, likely from an explosive device, had punctured the radiator and severed several critical electrical connections. Coolant was leaking rapidly and the engine was beginning to overheat. Without immediate repair, they would lose 1/3 of their evacuation capacity just when they needed it most. The sound of gunfire continued around her as Sarah worked with focused intensity. Her hands moved automatically through diagnostic procedures she had performed thousands of times, but never under such extreme circumstances. She could hear Rodriguez coordinating with the extraction team, and from his increasingly urgent tone, she understood that time was running out. "Martinez, how long for repairs?" Rodriguez called out between radio transmissions. "Give me 5 minutes," Sarah replied, already pulling emergency repair supplies from her kit. She had practiced rapid repairs countless times, but practicing in a garage was vastly different from working while bullets impacted nearby. Sarah began by stopping the coolant leak using emergency sealant and temporary patches. The repair wouldn't last long under normal operating conditions, but it only needed to function long enough to get everyone to safety. Her hands worked steadily despite the chaos around her, muscle memory guiding her through procedures that had become second nature. The electrical connections required more delicate work. Sarah traced each severed wire, using her emergency repair kit to splice temporary connections that would restore critical engine functions. She could feel sweat running down her back, partly from exertion and partly from stress, but she maintained her focus on the mechanical problems in front of her. As she worked, Sarah became aware that the pattern of gunfire was changing. What had been sporadic shooting was becoming more concentrated and closer to their position. She could hear Hayes and his team communicating tactical movements, but their voices carried increased urgency that indicated the situation was deteriorating. "We've got movement on the eastern ridge," Thompson's voice came through Rodriguez's radio. "Multiple contacts. Looks like they're trying to flank our position." Sarah's stomach tightened as she realized the enemy forces were attempting to surround them. She redoubled her efforts on the vehicle repairs, understanding that mobility might be their only chance of escape if the tactical situation continued to worsen. With the temporary radiator repair complete, Sarah turned her attention to the electrical system. The severed connections had disabled several critical functions, including the communication equipment and some of the emergency systems she had installed. Working with practiced efficiency, she restored power to the most essential components. 4 minutes, she called to Rodriguez, who was dividing his attention between radio communications and watching for enemy movement. Through the mechanical focus required for her repairs, Sarah began to notice details about the firefight that her training hadn't prepared her for. The sound of bullets passing overhead was different from anything she had experienced in training exercises. The urgency in the voices of experienced SEALs, men she had seen as nearly invincible, brought home the reality of how dangerous their situation had become. Anderson's voice came through the radio with a report that made Sarah's blood run cold. "We've got a problem, boss. Looks like reinforcements approaching from the south. At least 2 vehicles, possibly more personnel." Sarah could see Hayes and his team reassessing their tactical situation. The high-value target they had successfully extracted was now a liability that was limiting their movement options. while enemy reinforcements were reducing their chances of a clean escape. "Martinez, status on that vehicle?" Hayes called out, his voice carrying the controlled tension of a leader managing multiple critical problems simultaneously. "Almost finished," Sarah replied, making the final electrical connections. She tested the engine, hearing it turn over successfully despite the temporary nature of her repairs. The vehicle wouldn't win any reliability awards, but it would run long enough to complete their evacuation. As Sarah closed the hood and prepared to move back to a safer position, she heard a sound that chilled her to the bone. The distinctive whistle of incoming artillery fire was something she had only heard in training videos, but the real thing was unmistakably threatening. "Incoming!" Rodriguez shouted, and Sarah threw herself behind the vehicle just as the first artillery round impacted 50 meters from their position. The explosion was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. The ground shook beneath her. Dirt and debris rained down around the vehicles, and the overpressure made her ears ring. Through the chaos, she could hear the SEALs coordinating their response to this new threat. "We need to move now," Hayes announced over the radio. "Enemy forces have artillery support and they're bracketing our position." Sarah realized that her successful vehicle repair had just become critically important. With enemy reinforcements closing in and artillery fire beginning to target their location, their only chance of survival was rapid evacuation using all available vehicles. The extraction team began moving toward the vehicles in tactical formation, providing covering fire for each other while protecting the high-value target they had risked so much to retrieve. Sarah could see the precision and professionalism that made these men elite operators, but she could also see the strain that multiple threats were placing on even their exceptional capabilities. As the team reached the vehicles, Sarah noticed that Wilson, the medic, was supporting Thompson, who appeared to have sustained an injury to his left leg. The reality that people she had come to respect and trust were being wounded made the danger of their situation even more immediate and personal. "Martinez, take the wheel of the lead vehicle," Hayes ordered as the team loaded quickly into all three vehicles. "Rodriguez will navigate, and we need maximum speed to the secondary extraction point." Sarah slid behind the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she prepared for what she knew would be the most challenging drive of her life. The vehicles she had so carefully prepared were about to be tested not just mechanically, but as instruments of survival for 7 people whose lives depended on reaching safety. As the convoy prepared to move out, another artillery round impacted closer to their position, reminding everyone that time was running out. Sarah started the engine, feeling the reliable rumble of machinery that represented their lifeline back to safety. The next phase of their escape would test not only her mechanical skills, but her ability to perform under pressure in ways she had never imagined possible. The convoy moved out at maximum speed, with Sarah driving the lead vehicle while Rodriguez navigated using GPS and tactical maps. Behind them, Hayes coordinated the movements of the other 2 vehicles while maintaining communication with Extraction Command. The terrain was brutal, forcing Sarah to balance speed with the need to keep the vehicles operational on roads that were barely more than mountain trails. Within minutes of leaving their position, enemy contact resumed. Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of rifle fire, and several rounds impacted the armored plating she had installed on the vehicles. The modifications she had made were proving their worth, but she knew the armor wasn't designed to withstand sustained enemy fire indefinitely. "Contact left," Anderson's voice came through the radio from the second vehicle, multiple muzzle flashes on the ridgeline. Sarah focused on driving while Rodriguez coordinated return fire from their vehicle. The narrow mountain road limited their tactical options, forcing them to continue forward while under fire rather than taking evasive maneuvers that might provide better protection but would slow their escape. The first vehicle breakdown occurred as they rounded a sharp curve approximately 10 kilometers from their starting position. Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of tire failure from the third vehicle, followed by Hayes reporting that they had sustained significant tire damage from small arms fire. "All vehicles stop," Hayes ordered. "We need to assess damage and implement repairs." Sarah brought the convoy to a halt in a position that provided some cover from enemy observation, though she knew they were still vulnerable to artillery fire if the enemy could determine their location. She grabbed her emergency repair kit and rushed to examine the damaged vehicle. The situation was worse than she had hoped. 2 tires had been destroyed by enemy fire, and the spare tire capacity was insufficient to replace both damaged tires. Additionally, she could see that several bullet impacts had damaged other critical components, including part of the suspension system. "How long for repairs?" Hayes asked, his tactical awareness clearly focused on the multiple threats they were facing. Sarah assessed the damage, understanding that a conventional repair would take at least an hour, time they definitely didn't have with enemy forces in pursuit, and their position potentially exposed to artillery fire. "I can get us mobile in 15 minutes, but it won't be pretty," she replied, already formulating an unconventional repair strategy using available materials. Working with desperate efficiency, Sarah began implementing field-expedient repairs that violated every maintenance manual she had ever studied. She used emergency tire sealant to temporarily patch one of the damaged tires, then improvised a repair for the second tire using materials from her emergency kit, combined with parts cannibalized from non-critical vehicle systems. While Sarah worked on the tire repairs, Rodriguez and Anderson maintained security, watching for signs of enemy pursuit. Their vigilance proved necessary when Rodriguez spotted movement on a distant ridge that suggested enemy forces were attempting to track their movements. "We've got potential pursuit," Rodriguez reported. "Looks like at least one vehicle, possibly more, approximately 3 kilometers behind us." Sarah's hands moved even faster as she completed the tire repairs and began addressing the suspension damage. The improvised repairs wouldn't last long under normal conditions, but they only needed to function long enough to reach the extraction point. As she worked, Sarah became aware that the high-value target they had extracted was conscious, and observing her repair efforts with obvious concern. The man understood enough about their situation to realize that mechanical failure could result in capture or death for everyone involved. 12 minutes, Sarah announced, installing the second repaired tire and beginning work on the damaged suspension components. The suspension repair required even more creative improvisation. Using welding equipment from her emergency kit, Sarah fabricated temporary reinforcements that would allow the vehicle to continue operating despite structural damage. The repairs were crude but functional, designed to last just long enough to complete their escape. As Sarah completed the suspension work, she heard the sound that indicated their time was running out. Engine noise from the pursuing enemy vehicles was becoming audible, suggesting they were closing the distance to the disabled convoy. "Enemy vehicles confirmed," Thompson reported from his observation position. 2 vehicles, armed personnel approximately 2 kilometers in closing. Sarah performed final checks on her repairs. Understanding that this improvised work was about to be tested under the most extreme conditions possible, she had never attempted such extensive field repairs under combat conditions. But her mechanical instincts told her the vehicles would hold together long enough to reach safety. "Ready to move," she announced, wiping grease from her hands as she prepared to return to the driver's seat. The convoy resumed movement, but Sarah could immediately feel the mechanical stress of pushing damaged vehicles to their operational limits. The repaired tire was holding, but she could sense instability in the suspension that required constant attention to maintain control on the rough terrain. Behind them, the pursuing enemy vehicles were gaining ground. Hayes made the tactical decision to increase speed despite the mechanical risks, understanding that capture was a worse alternative than potential vehicle breakdown. "Martinez, we need maximum speed," Hayes instructed through the radio. "Extraction helicopter is en route to the secondary pickup point, but we need to reach it before enemy reinforcements can establish a blocking position." Sarah pressed the accelerator, feeling the vehicles respond despite their damaged condition. The modifications she had made during preparation were proving their worth, allowing the vehicles to maintain high-speed operation even with significant battle damage. As they approached a narrow section of mountain road, Rodriguez spotted a potential problem that made Sarah's heart sink. "Road damage ahead," he announced. "Looks like someone set off explosives to create a roadblock." Through the windshield, Sarah could see that a section of the mountain road had been destroyed, creating a gap that would be impossible to cross with conventional driving techniques. However, her mechanical knowledge suggested an alternative approach that was dangerous but potentially feasible. "I can get us across," she told Hayes, her voice carrying more confidence than she felt. "But it's going to require precise timing and maximum engine power." What Sarah was proposing was essentially using the vehicle's momentum and her understanding of their mechanical capabilities to jump the gap in the road. It was a maneuver that violated every principle of safe vehicle operation, but with enemy forces closing in and no alternative route available, it represented their only chance of escape. The success of this desperate plan would depend entirely on Sarah's ability to judge speed, timing, and the mechanical limits of vehicles that had already been pushed far beyond their design specifications. Sarah studied the damaged road section, calculating angles, distances, and the mechanical capabilities of their vehicles. The gap was approximately 12 feet wide, with a drop-off on the far side that would require precise landing to avoid catastrophic impact. Her engineering background told her it was theoretically possible, but the margin for error was virtually non-existent. All vehicles maintain tight formation, Sarah instructed through the radio. We're going to take this gap at maximum speed. Everyone needs to brace for impact on landing. Behind them, the pursuing enemy vehicles were closing rapidly, and Sarah could see muzzle flashes indicating they were taking fire, even as they approached the most dangerous part of their escape route. Time was running out, and hesitation would mean capture or death for everyone. Sarah accelerated the lead vehicle to maximum speed, feeling the engine strain against the limits of its modifications. The repaired tire held despite the stress, and the improvised suspension repairs maintained vehicle control even as they approached speeds that were dangerous on the rough mountain terrain. 30 seconds to jump, Rodriguez announced, gripping his restraints as he prepared for what everyone understood could be their final maneuver. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel as she made final adjustments to their approach angle. Her mechanical instincts were calculating weight distribution, suspension compression, and engine power curves in real time, trying to optimize their chances of successfully clearing the gap. The lead vehicle hit the approach ramp at maximum speed, and for a moment that seemed to last forever. They were airborne. Sarah could feel the vehicle's momentum carrying them across the gap while gravity began pulling them downward toward what could be either successful landing or catastrophic impact. The landing was violent but successful. The vehicle's reinforced suspension absorbed most of the impact, though Sarah could hear mechanical components straining under forces they were never designed to handle. More importantly, they were across the gap and still operational. Vehicle 2, go now, Sarah instructed, watching in her mirrors as Hayes brought the second vehicle up to speed for their attempt. The second vehicle's jump was equally successful, though Sarah could see they had sustained additional damage during landing. The improvised repairs were holding, but she knew they were operating on borrowed time mechanically. The third vehicle, carrying Wilson and Thompson along with the high-value target, faced the most challenging situation. The tire and suspension damage from earlier made it the least reliable of the three vehicles. But there was no alternative to attempting the jump with enemy forces now within small arms range. Anderson, driving the third vehicle, approached the gap with determination that reflected the SEAL team's commitment to leaving no one behind. Sarah watched anxiously as the damaged vehicle accelerated toward the jump point, knowing that mechanical failure at this critical moment would be catastrophic. The third vehicle launched across the gap, but Sarah could immediately see something was wrong. The damaged suspension caused an unstable flight path, and the vehicle was rotating slightly as it crossed the void. When it landed, the impact was much harder than the previous two vehicles, and Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of major mechanical failure. Vehicle 3 is down, Anderson reported, his voice tight with pain. We've lost mobility and I think Wilson is injured. Sarah could see the third vehicle had landed successfully but was now immobilized approximately 50 meters behind their position. Steam was rising from the engine compartment, indicating catastrophic cooling system failure, and the vehicle was listing to one side, suggesting major suspension damage. Hayes, take the high-value target and continue to extraction point, Sarah announced, making a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. I'm going back for the others. Negative, Martinez, Hayes replied immediately. We don't leave anyone behind, but we're not risking additional personnel. Sarah was already out of her vehicle and grabbing her emergency repair kit. Sir, with respect, I'm the only one who can assess if that vehicle is repairable. And if it's not, we need to extract Wilson and Thompson before enemy forces reach this position. The pursuing enemy vehicles had been temporarily stopped by the gap in the road, but Sarah could see personnel dismounting and preparing to cross on foot. They had perhaps 10 minutes before hostile forces would be in position to engage them with direct fire. Sarah sprinted toward the disabled vehicle, her mind already analyzing the mechanical problems she could observe. The engine was overheating severely, one wheel was completely destroyed, and hydraulic fluid was leaking from multiple points in the suspension system. When she reached the vehicle, she found Wilson unconscious with what appeared to be a head injury from the hard landing. Thompson was alert, but his earlier leg wound had been aggravated by the impact, and Anderson was struggling with what looked like a dislocated shoulder. "Can you fix it?" Anderson asked, his voice reflecting both hope and desperation. Sarah performed a rapid assessment of the damage, her mechanical expertise allowing her to quickly identify the critical failures. The cooling system was destroyed beyond field repair, the suspension was catastrophically damaged, and the destroyed wheel made the vehicle immobile even if the other problems could be addressed. "No," she said bluntly. "This vehicle is done. We need to get you to one of the other vehicles." Thompson, despite his injuries, was alert enough to understand their tactical situation. "Enemy personnel are crossing the gap on foot," he reported, pointing toward the damaged road section. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before they're in weapons range." Sarah looked at the distance between their position and the other vehicles, calculating whether they could move Wilson and Thompson that distance before enemy forces could establish firing positions. The math was not encouraging, especially with Wilson unconscious and Thompson's mobility limited by his leg injury. "Change of plans," Sarah announced, surprising herself with the decisiveness in her voice. "We're going to hold this position and slow down enemy advance while the others continue to extraction." Anderson stared at her with surprise. "Martinez, you're not a combat operator. You don't have the training or experience for this kind of engagement." Sarah was pulling equipment from the disabled vehicle, including additional ammunition and the emergency medical supplies Wilson had given her earlier. "Maybe not, but I have the motivation. These people trusted me with their lives, and I'm not going to let them down now." Through her radio, she could hear Hayes coordinating with Extraction Command, reporting their situation and requesting immediate support. However, the nearest friendly forces were at least 30 minutes away, while enemy personnel would be in weapons range within minutes. "Hayes, continue to extraction point with the high-value target," Sarah instructed through her radio. "We'll delay enemy advance and extract on secondary helicopter when it arrives." "Martinez, I'm not leaving my people," Hayes replied, his voice carrying the absolute conviction that had made him a successful SEAL team leader. Sarah was checking Thompson's leg wound while keeping watch on approaching enemy personnel. "Sir, the mission objective is more important than any individual. The intelligence that target is carrying could save American lives. You need to complete the extraction." What Sarah was proposing was essentially a rearguard action that would allow the primary mission to succeed while accepting significant risk for the personnel who remained behind. It was a tactical decision that reflected military priorities she had studied, but never expected to implement personally. As enemy personnel continued approaching their position, Sarah realized she was about to face combat situations that her mechanical training had never prepared her for. However, her determination to protect her injured teammates and ensure mission success was overriding her fears about engaging in direct combat with hostile forces. The next few minutes would test not only her courage under fire, but her ability to think tactically while applying whatever combat skills she could remember from her basic training. Sarah positioned herself behind the disabled vehicle, using its bulk as cover while she assessed their defensive capabilities. Anderson, despite his dislocated shoulder, was still combat effective and began setting up a defensive position using equipment from the vehicle. Thompson, though wounded, was alert and could provide supporting fire from a protected position. The approaching enemy forces numbered approximately 50 personnel, moving in tactical formation across the rough terrain. Sarah watched them advance, her mechanical mind automatically analyzing their movement patterns and estimating time until they would be within effective weapons range. "Martinez, you don't have to do this," Anderson said, recognizing the courage required for a non-combat specialist to engage in direct firefight with trained hostile forces. Sarah checked her M4 carbine, remembering the hasty training she had received just hours earlier. "These people trusted me with their lives when they brought me on this mission. I'm not going to fail them now." The first enemy contact came from approximately 400 meters, with rifle fire impacting around their position. Sarah found herself responding with training she barely remembered, returning fire while maintaining cover behind the vehicle. The engagement felt surreal, like she was watching someone else participate in combat operations. Anderson coordinated their defensive fire, his combat experience allowing him to direct their limited resources effectively against a much larger enemy force. "Aim for the lead elements," he instructed. "We need to slow their advance, not necessarily eliminate everyone." Sarah's mechanical background proved unexpectedly useful in combat. Her understanding of trajectories and angles helped her estimate range and adjust her fire for maximum effectiveness. She found herself thinking about bullet ballistics the same way she thought about engine timing or hydraulic pressure. The enemy forces, initially confident about overrunning what they assumed was a small, isolated group, began encountering more resistance than expected. Sarah's accurate fire, combined with Anderson's tactical expertise and Thompson's supporting fire, created an effective defensive position that slowed the enemy advance significantly. "Hayes, what's your status?" Sarah asked through her radio during a brief lull in enemy fire. "Approaching extraction point," Hayes replied. "Helicopter inbound, estimated arrival in 15 minutes. Can you hold your position that long?" Sarah looked at their ammunition supply, assessed the enemy forces still advancing toward their position, and calculated the likelihood of maintaining effective resistance for another 15 minutes. The mathematics were not encouraging, but determination was sometimes more important than statistics. "We'll hold," she replied, surprising herself with the confidence in her voice. The enemy forces began coordinating more sophisticated attacks, attempting to flank their position while maintaining suppressive fire from multiple directions. Sarah found herself moving between defensive positions, using her knowledge of the vehicle's mechanical layout to maximize their protective value. During one particularly intense exchange of fire, Sarah noticed movement that the others had missed. A small group of enemy personnel was attempting to circle around their position, potentially setting up an attack from their unprotected rear. Without thinking, she left her covered position to engage this flanking movement. Sarah's movement exposed her to enemy fire, but her focus was entirely on preventing the tactical maneuver that could overwhelm their defensive position. She engaged the flanking force with accurate fire that disrupted their movement and forced them to seek cover rather than completing their intended attack. "Martinez, get back to cover," Anderson shouted, recognizing the risk she was taking by operating in an exposed position. However, Sarah had identified another tactical opportunity. The enemy force's attention was focused on their current defensive position, creating an opening for a more aggressive defensive action. Using her understanding of mechanical systems, she began implementing an improvised strategy that none of them had considered. Sarah had noticed that the disabled vehicle still contained fuel and various mechanical fluids that could be used to create defensive obstacles. Working quickly, she began preparing improvised explosive devices using materials from her emergency repair kit, combined with automotive fluids from the vehicle. "What are you doing?" Thompson asked, maintaining defensive fire while watching Sarah's unusual preparations. "Creating force multipliers," Sarah replied, using engineering terminology to describe what was essentially combat innovation. Under extreme pressure, her improvised devices wouldn't be effective against trained military personnel under normal circumstances, but the enemy forces were advancing across predictable terrain that allowed her to position obstacles in strategic locations. When the devices detonated, they created confusion and temporary disruption that allowed the three defenders to maintain their position against much larger enemy forces. The engagement continued for another 10 minutes, with Sarah increasingly taking tactical initiative that surprised both her teammates and herself. Her mechanical understanding of cause and effect seemed to translate effectively to combat problem solving, allowing her to identify opportunities that traditional combat training might not have recognized. Finally, they could hear the distinctive sound of approaching helicopter rotors. The extraction aircraft was arriving, but enemy forces were still close enough to threaten the landing zone. Sarah realized they needed one final defensive action to ensure successful extraction for everyone. "Cover me," Sarah announced, preparing to leave their defensive position one last time. What she was planning was tactically risky but potentially decisive. Using the last of her improvised devices and her understanding of the terrain features around their position, Sarah intended to create enough disruption among enemy forces to allow safe helicopter landing and extraction for all personnel. As she moved toward the enemy positions, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in the past day. This morning she had been a mechanic focused on routine vehicle maintenance. Now she was implementing combat tactics against 50 hostile forces while protecting wounded teammates and ensuring mission success. The extraction helicopter touched down just as Sarah's final improvised devices created the confusion necessary for safe evacuation. As they loaded Wilson, Thompson, and Anderson aboard the aircraft, Sarah realized she had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed, tested under conditions she had never imagined facing. Looking back at the battlefield as the helicopter lifted off, Sarah understood that her military career would never be the same. She had proven herself under the most extreme conditions possible, demonstrating that courage and determination could overcome limitations in training or experience. Most importantly, she had kept faith with the trust that Hayes and his team had placed in her abilities, ensuring that everyone returned home safely despite overwhelming odds against their survival.